Today, we're going to talk about a moment, a real knife's edge moment that completely changed the destiny of a nation. We're talking about the week in 1991 that brought India to its knees and, in doing so, sparked an economic revolution that's still playing out today. Okay, let's get right into it.
I want you to picture this. It's the summer of 1991, and this was the terrifying reality facing the world's largest democracy. India, a country with over 850 million people, had just 21 days' worth of money left. Just enough to pay for about 3 weeks of essential imports. We're talking oil, food, vital medicines. After that, the country would default.
Just let that sink in for a second. What would that even feel like? This wasn't some abstract number on a spreadsheet that only economists cared about. No, this was a ticking clock that threatened empty shelves, gas stations running dry, and a future of complete and profound uncertainty for every single person.
So, what did it all boil down to? This number. India's foreign exchange reserves, the money it needs to trade with the rest of the world, had collapsed to just over $1 billion. To put that in perspective, that is barely enough to keep the lights on for a country that size. For the first time in its history, India was staring down the barrel of defaulting on its international loans.
So, how do you pull back from a cliff edge like that? Well, the government was pushed into an act of pure desperation, something that honestly was completely unthinkable just a short time before.
That's right. This wasn't some digital transfer. In a series of top-secret flights, India physically airlifted 67 metric tons of its own gold reserves and flew them to the vaults of the Bank of England and the Union Bank of Switzerland. We're talking about the nation's family jewels literally being boxed up and flown out of the country just to get an emergency loan.
And you can imagine, when this news eventually leaked, boy, the reaction was just explosive. The very idea that India, a country so proud of its independence, had to pawn its gold was seen as a national humiliation. It was a deep, psychological blow. The political firestorm that followed, it was so fierce that it brought down the very government that had to make that impossible choice.
Okay, so that's the what, but the bigger question, the one we really need to unpack, is how. How on earth did things get this bad? Well, the answer lies in 40 years of economic policy that had essentially locked the country in a cage of its own making.
And it had a name, the License Raj, the rule of the license. Now, it started with good intentions after independence, to protect Indian industries and become self-sufficient. But in reality, it became a suffocating, tangled web of government control that basically strangled any hope of real growth or innovation.
And just look at how absurd this system was in practice. You want to start a company? You need a license for that. Okay, great, your company is successful and you want to expand and make more. Nope, you need another license for that. Want to innovate and create a new product? Another license. Want to import a single piece of machinery? You guessed it, another license. And for each of these, you might have to deal with up to 80 different government agencies. It was a system that didn't just discourage ambition, it actively punished it.
And if you want a perfect real-world example of what this felt like, just listen to this from N.R. Narayana Murthy, the man who would later go on to co-found the tech giant Infosys.
3 years and 50 separate trips to the capital city just for permission to import one computer. Think about all that wasted time and energy.
And what was the result of all this? Decades of stagnation. I mean, look at the difference. While other countries in Asia, the so-called Asian tigers like South Korea, were just taking off like rockets, growing at over 7% a year, India was stuck in first gear, chugging along at what economists sarcastically called the Hindu rate of growth, a pathetic 1% per year. The world was moving on, and India was being left behind.
So, you have to think of the license Raj as this chronic illness, right? It was slowly, year after year, weakening the economic body. But then, in 1990, a whole bunch of things happened at once that turned this long-term sickness into a sudden, life-threatening emergency. And it was just one thing after another, a total cascade failure. First, Iraq invades Kuwait, and oil prices go through the roof, hitting India's import bill hard. Then, in the middle of this, the government collapses, creating massive political instability. That, of course, spooks international investors, and India's credit rating gets downgraded to junk. And then, as if that wasn't enough, in the middle of the ensuing election campaign, the former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi is assassinated. It was the perfect storm.
But it's often out of total chaos that real change can happen. A new government was formed, and at its head were two men, A really unlikely duo who would end up becoming the architects of modern India. They were about to push through reforms that everyone else considered political suicide. On one side, you had the new Prime Minister, P.V. Narasimha Rao. He was a quiet, 70-year-old political veteran who was literally packing his bags to retire when he was suddenly thrust into the top job. And his choice for finance minister? Dr. Manmohan Singh, a brilliant, Cambridge-educated economist, a technocrat, not a career politician. So you had the perfect team, really. Rao, the savvy political operator, took the heat and shielded the process from criticism. And Singh? He was the brilliant mind who drew up the actual blueprint for change.
And that brings us to July 24th, 1991. Dr. Singh stands up in Parliament to deliver what would become, without a doubt, the most important budget speech in the country's history. And he ended it with this powerful quote from the writer Victor Hugo, basically telling the whole world, the old way of doing things is over, a new idea has arrived, and you can't stop it.
So what was this revolutionary idea? Well, the new blueprint was famously built on three simple, powerful pillars. You might hear them called the LPG reforms. First, liberalization. The entire license raj was systematically dismantled. Second, privatization. Massive, inefficient state-owned monopolies were broken up. And finally, globalization. India ripped down its protectionist walls and opened its doors to the world.
And the impact? Wow. It was immediate, and it was absolutely staggering. After crashing to just 1% growth in 1991, the very next year, the economy came roaring back to life, growing by over 5%. It was like the floodgates opened. Foreign investment, which had been just a trickle, suddenly poured in. The shock therapy, as drastic as it was, seemed to be working.
But this is where the story gets complicated, because this is no simple fairy tale. The very same reforms that kicked off all this incredible growth also ripped open some deep, painful fractures in Indian society. And that's the complex legacy we're still dealing with right now.
You see, in a way, the old licensed Raj was just replaced by a new billionaire Raj. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're pretty shocking. The top 1% of the population now owns 40% of the country's wealth. The top 10%, they hold over 3/4 of it. The gap between the rich and poor exploded.
And this really gets to the heart of the paradox. A tale of two Indias literally started to emerge. In one India, you had a booming, world-class IT sector, global companies flooding in, and the country becoming a major economic power. But in the other India, you had what's called jobless growth. The economy was growing, but not creating enough good jobs. You had a devastating crisis in agriculture that, between 1995 and 2018, tragically led to the suicides of nearly 400,000 farmers.
So what's the takeaway here? I think it's this. The 1991 reforms were a desperate, high-stakes gamble. And you know what? It paid off. They absolutely saved the economy from total collapse. But that survival came with a huge social price tag, creating winners and losers on a massive scale that the country is still trying to reckon with.
And that leaves us right here, with the defining question for India today. The 1991 reforms undoubtedly put the nation on a new, faster track. But the journey is far from over. And the next chapter of India's story will be all about answering this one question. Can it find a way to grow, not just quickly, but fairly for all its people?